So, a quick introduction of Arjun Dubashi. Arjun started his career with Amazon as an SDE intern back in 2016 and is today a senior software development engineer at Amazon.
Before, maybe 5, 6 years back, it may be enough to, be able to have a good framework, be able to have, a good process and going through the questions. I think now you may need to have more and deeper knowledge over these more obscure topics of system design.
Hello, Arjun, and welcome to IK Insights video series, where we're going to talk to our very own IK instructors and deep dive into interview rounds, interview curriculum, and tips to ace interviews at top companies and the Fangs. So, a quick introduction of Arjun Dubashi before we get into the questions. Arjun started his career with Amazon as an SDE intern back in 2016 and is today a senior software development engineer at Amazon. Having spent 6 years at Amazon, Arjun is helping bring his expertise to the life of thousands of aspiring software engineers who are looking to up-level in their careers by cracking tough technical interviews at Fangs. Today, we're going to talk all about system design interviews at top companies. So, Arjun, my first question to you. Given a system design question in an interview, what is the best approach that a candidate should follow to ensure that the requirements are very clear to themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. The number one thing I would say, and this is going to be something that'll probably come up over and over again. I'm sure it's covered in the IK curriculum and things like that, but it's going to be to always ask questions. I think asking questions is going to be super critical when given a system design problem. In some cases, there are cases, and I've seen this happen before, where sometimes you'll have a particularly tough interviewer, and even if you do get the question right, maybe it's a common question you've seen on, grokking the system design interview, one of the IK courseworks. They may ding you even though you didn't ask enough questions. They may say, oh, well, they knew the requirements, they understood it, but they didn't really try to probe and ask questions. So you definitely want to be very active in that part of the interview. I call it, the requirements gathering stage. So that's very critical. I would say it's probably the most critical stage of the interview, right? Like requirements gathering is always going to happen regardless of the system design. Like in some cases, maybe the diagram is less important. In some cases, you may not have to scale it up as much depending on the question. But in every case, you're going to have to do some sort of requirements gathering. So having a good framework and having a good set of standard questions you want to ask yourself. And I think it's best to do this person by person of functional, non-functional, regionalization, security, those types of things. Like be very active in that first 10 minutes and really try to drive that process. It's different, I would say, than coding. I think in coding, they'll say that there's ambiguity, and I think there is, but in general, the question should be at least somewhat clear. They won't try to just make you ask a bunch of questions on a coding question. But for system design, I don't think it's uncommon to spend the first 15 minutes or so just asking questions.
Do you have a template or a framework that you follow or you've seen candidates follow in your career interviewing at Amazon?
I don't know about a specific template. I think one framework that I've seen used in IK coursework and then also in other interviews as well is look at functional and non-functional requirements. So functional requirements are things like how the customer uses it, what features do you have, and the non-functional are things like scalability, making trade-offs between consistency versus availability, those types of things. So I think as long as you're covering both of those key areas, that should I think that should cover everything that you need to cover. So functional and non-functional, and I think I would even tell the interviewer I'm going to be talking, let's cover the functional requirements and then cover the non-functional. That being explicit about that can go a long way.
All right. So, Arjun, we went from layoffs to recession, and now we're seeing a pickup in hiring once again, right? Are you observing any changes in system design interview processes across levels, given the current market scenario?
I would say no. I think in general, the market kind of affects, at least for larger companies. I'm honestly not as sure about smaller places, but the market will affect the amount of roles that are open and maybe the types of roles that are open. I know in a lot of cases, unfortunately, junior level hiring, university hiring has been cut maybe more severely than senior level hiring. But it shouldn't affect the actual interview loop,
The
right?
action.
So the decisions around headcount and how many people are going to get hired are so far above the level of people that are actually in the interview or in the interview loops, and they're going to ask their questions the same way they've always have. So I wouldn't really think too much about is the current situation gonna affect things.
All right. So let me change up the question a little bit. You've been at Amazon for 6 years now. Have you seen system design interviews change over these years in all your in all your experience interviewing candidates?
I
What do you
would
see in your
say
IT?
in some ways I think they've definitely gotten harder.
Mm-hmm.
And they've gotten a little bit more difficult to
Mm-hmm.
understand, and that maybe partially because there's been similar to coding. I think this is much more noticeable in coding, to be honest. But you know, before the advent of Leak Code and grokking the system design interview and all these different courses, um, it used to be, I would say, a lot. There used to be a much smaller subset of questions that could be asked, and now that pool is kind of widened a little bit more. So for system design, I would say you used to just get a pretty standard set of questions around building a Facebook, building YouTube, building Twitter, those types of things. Now they are asking more difficult ones, like building a message processing system. Um, a few other ones, like designing a rate limiter was one that I like a lot and has been used more. So I think maybe what I would say is before, maybe 5-6 years back, it may be enough to be able to have a good framework, be able to have a good process and going through the questions. I think now you may need to have more and deeper knowledge over these more obscure topics of system design, of like rate limiting, message processing, async versus non-async, those types of things. So it's definitely advanced a little bit more. I still think the fundamentals are still valid, and I still think
Mm-hmm.
80 to 90% of the questions you'll get will be design Facebook, design YouTube, design these pretty standard systems. But I have seen there's a lot more complicated questions that are kind of coming into the fray at this point.
All right. And are we seeing these complicated questions coming in only at the tier one companies, or do you happen to know if it's across the board that we're seeing companies up the difficulty level of their system design interviews?
I think it's pretty much across the board, because I think the prep that you get on system design is kind of across the board. So I would say
Mhm.
it's pretty universal that interviews have gotten,
Mhm.
in general, I would say, harder for both coding and system design.
All right. So Arjun, now we have like two questions for you. One is, what does an interviewer look for in a system design interview? And so how should a candidate best represent a design in an interview, keeping that in mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the number one thing of like how to best represent a design is a very clear, concise diagram goes a long way. Um, and this is something I tell anyone I interview at IK, either in the feedback or before the interviews. You definitely want to make explicit every single piece in the diagram, every single piece in the design, even if you feel like it's a little excessive. So as an example, a lot of the times candidates will be designing a system and they'll say, okay, well, I have an API endpoint over here and I'm calling it, but they won't necessarily call out the load balancer involved. So that's, in a normal, setting of you're building a system, that may be fine, right? Because the load balancer kind of comes along with, API gateway or all these other, services that provide that for us. But in a system design interview, you definitely want to be clear about calling that out of like, okay, there's a load balancer here, there's an app server here, that sort of thing. So being super explicit and being very detailed, even almost like I would say overly detailed, given especially when comparing it to how you would maybe show a system or a system design for like your company, because a lot of times people would make assumptions there. You definitely would just want to be like very painstakingly detailed when drawing it out. So that's what the interviewer will look for. I think that's the most important thing, is they want you to see that you're kind of detail oriented, that you can be given an ambiguous problem and kind of break it down into these different minute parts and be able to ask those questions. And they also want to see that you're able to deal with ambiguity by doing requirements gathering. So it kind of gets back to what we were talking about before. Be very detailed in your requirements as well, and that also kind of covers the design aspect.
Got it. So for roles such as embedded engineering and security engineering, how are the system design rounds and interviews different?
Yeah, it's a good
And
question.
also, like, what are some of the topics, from the whole curriculum out there for system design? What are some of the topics that, someone should focus on?
Yeah, so embedded is I think almost a different beast. I think embedded, I've seen questions like design a multiplexer that almost gets to, I don't have a ton of experience in this area, but that almost gets to, talking more about like embedded system design as opposed to, the standard stuff that we're talking about today. Security engineering, I think, can have much more of an overlap. So they may ask for you to design like a password hashing system, those sorts of things. So, and this kind of goes for, even if it's just a standard SDE role, a lot of the times companies will ask questions that are somewhat close to their domain, right? So as an example, if you're working in like Amazon operations, it's a pretty common question to be asked, like design a trailer location system or like geo fences for trailers so we can understand where all of them are. Like that's, in some sense, that's a pretty standard system design question, but it is like very domain specific of like, this is specific to an ops use case. So I think that's kind of how I would look at it, is if you're interviewing for one of those specific, types of roles like security engineering or something like that, I would take the time to do the standard system designs, but I would also take the time to do the kind of non-standard, a little bit more obscure topics that are more specific to the role that you're interviewing for.
All right. So, Arjun, we were talking to another instructor a few days back from Google, and she mentioned that, in Google, they're specifically looking for creative solutions. They're looking for people to be very creative in interviews. Does Amazon look for, any such X factor, any particular thing from their candidates? Do you have, like, within Amazon, do you all have some unique trait that, everyone looks for in candidates? Or maybe how are Amazon system design interviews different from all the other companies? Maybe that could be a
You
better
know,
question.
I don't know if I would necessarily say that we have creative or anything related to creative as a competency in system
Mm-hmm.
design interviews. I think one competency that I do see come up that may or may not be like distinctly called out in like an interviewing guide is dealing with ambiguity. So I think that's the main thing that they look for from system design, from a system design aspect, is like, given an ambiguous problem, can this person break it down? And while
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't necessarily map to a specific, technical competency, data structures and algorithms,
Yeah.
problem solving, it's very relevant to the role, especially when you're talking about more senior level roles like senior principal, those types of levels. I think it becomes a much more important. So I don't know if I would necessarily say creative, but definitely dealing with ambiguity is something we look for a lot.
All right. So system design use cases involving batch processing or offline processing require significant knowledge of data structures and algorithms, right? So how does one prepare for such interviews?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there is one good thing is that there's no shortage of kind of coursework or books that are available on this topic that may not necessarily rely on having great knowledge of data structures and algorithms. So one book that's probably been called out a few times, but I'll go ahead and call it out again, is Designing Data Intensive Systems. That is a very complex book. I think it's pretty well known. But it does do a good job of summarizing these very complex concepts like batch processing, the CAP theorem, those types of things. But it's simple enough that I think if you had a pretty basic CS understanding of like, you knew how to code, but maybe you're not super experienced in writing stuff end to end, I think you could be able to kind of handle that. So that's maybe what I would say is I would take the time to really prep for it. But I wouldn't necessarily think that, I have to like really understand data structures and algorithms for the system design portion. I don't think that's probably a good use of time. I think, taking the time to do that for coding maybe, but for system design, I think there's enough kind of coursework and things like that you can kind of make it work without having to, study, data structures and algorithms.
All right. And how important are system design interviews for PMs and TPMs? And how important is DSA, for PMs and TPMs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, for system design for engineering managers or TPMs is asked. It is one of the technical competencies that's asked at Amazon. It is, I would say, pretty important to kind of understand because that's, while as a TPM or an SDM, you may not be directly designing systems, people will kind of look to you for that technical guidance, right? So they want to do at least a slight check to kind of make sure that you understand it. Maybe not at the same level as the engineers, but maybe a pretty similar level. That being said, I think for engineering managers, TPMs, um, that experience is a little bit harder to find, and because of that, they probably will weight the system design a little bit less for those types of roles. So it may be more related to you and your experience, your work history, those types of things, as opposed to like the strict system design. I would say the interview itself, though, is not that different. It'll probably be asked by the same type of person, probably same types of questions, probably evaluated the same. I think the only thing that really changes with the different roles or different levels is that the weight that the interview is given is much heavier for maybe I would say for like a senior software engineer, the weight of system design interview is going to be pretty high because that's a lot of what they'll be expecting that person to own, either owning their own designs or advising others. For an engineering manager, it might be a little bit less important. TPM probably a little bit less important. But for those kind of high level technical IC roles, it's probably one of the more important interviews that you'll take. But it kind of goes for roles that are maybe a little bit heavier in coding, it's probably a little bit less important. For roles that are more centered around people management, it's probably a little less important.
All right. So Arjun, now I want to shift gears to prep, and you also brought up prep in the previous question that I asked you. What resources or what free resources are available out there? You also mentioned a book sometime back. What free resources are available out there for engineers to prep for system design interviews?
Yeah,
Anything that you're aware of? Yeah.
that's a great question. For free resources, I think YouTube is probably the best option. There is all sorts of, I don't know any specific channels off the top of my head, but there's all sorts of like kind of great content out there for these kind of classic problems that'll kind of walk you through how they'll be asked. Um, for paid resources, I think things like grokking the system design interview, designing data intensive systems are good. For free resources, I think YouTube is probably the best option. And then also YouTube, and then kind of taking, the question that you want to solve, maybe Googling for it a bit. And there are probably some pretty great articles out there that would kind of explain it end to end. I think those are probably the best options if you're looking for free prep.
And do you think enough, if someone does enough of prep with the free resources, that's enough to crack an interview at the Fangs?
I think so. Yeah, I would say it is. And I would say, especially for kind of the lower levels, or maybe not lower levels, but kind of mid-level SDEs where you're going to be asked system design, it's not going to be the most important. I think that's more than enough. For, a principal engineer, for, someone who's expected to be a little bit higher, I would maybe spend a little bit more time on system design because you won't necessarily be asked coding as much. System design will probably take on more of a weight at that point.
All right. So for EMs, the system design interviews are of course different from ICs. So how does an EM prepare in this context? You also spoke about principal engineers. So, but how does an EM, how are these rounds different for EMs, and how does one prepare for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think what I would say is that the interview itself would not necessarily be different for an engineering manager, but the weight that it's given would be a little
The
bit
weightage,
different.
okay.
So
Yeah.
I think taking the time, do the prep, whether it's paid or unpaid, but it'll be definitely less important than your people management experience and being able to answer those questions, those types of things. I don't know if it would necessarily. I think the interview itself, at least at a big company, maybe at a smaller company where it's more kind of targeted, of like they're asking system design from an engineering manager perspective, might be a slightly different. But from a big tech company perspective, it would be pretty uniform.
All right. Coming to mistakes made in system design interviews, do you see, are there any common patterns or common mistakes that you see candidates make in system design interviews that they should avoid? This is more in the context of what mistakes should be avoided in system design interviews.
Yeah, no, great. That's a great question. I think the number one thing, and this kind of gets back to what we were talking about before with requirements, is being kind of too overly eager to start designing without kind of asking those questions. And I think people sometimes think, maybe people feel the time pressure, which is of course understandable, but people decide to kind of just start designing or just start like doing a diagram, calling out different services. And they don't ask those kind of clarifying questions of what the system is, what the data models look like, what the use case is. And that's going to be very critical. You definitely want to make sure you're kind of taking that, I would even say probably 20 minutes of the actual interview to see like what the actual, what the actual use case of the services or the system is. So that's number one. I think that's the main kind of slip up. I think the other kind of other thing that can trip people up on system design interviews is not understanding the technical aspects of it really well, or maybe well enough. So sometimes people will kind of call out a design choice and they won't necessarily be able to justify that design choice. So someone may say, I'm going to use a relational SQL database here, but they won't necessarily be able to give a good reason for it, or they'll say, oh, that's the one I'm familiar with. And that's not necessarily an answer that you want to be giving. You want to be able to kind of show your technical competency by making those kind of design trade-offs like in the course of the interview. So you always want to be able to give a reason, show some thought behind your thinking. It doesn't have to be super detailed. Like sometimes it can be like a short sentence, but you never want to say, well, I'm using it for, for no reason or something like that. That's definitely a pretty big negative factor. So I think in general, I would say just be deliberate, and then you should be able to avoid a lot of these common pitfalls.
All right. So Arjun, in your experience, what percentage of candidates don't do well in system design rounds after acing a DSA round? Do you see that happening where candidates spend a lot of time, they do really well in algorithms, DSA rounds, and then they're not performing that well in system design? Or do you see it happening the other way around, which I think is rare?
Yeah, I would say the reverse is probably more common, just because I think system design, one of the great things about it, I would say, is that it is fundamentally a process. So I feel that if you're given a system design and you go through your process, you do your requirements, you have a good technical understanding, you're probably going to do pretty well. If you compare that to coding, and this is in some sense unfortunate, I think there are cases where you can be a great engineer. You can even be great at those types of leak code or cracking the coding interview style questions. But sometimes you just get a question and you're completely stumped and you're not able to solve it, and you just get kind of lost. And even to the best people, that happens. But that's less probable, I think, for system design. So I would say it's much more likely that I would see someone do well in system design and then maybe not do as well in coding. And that's one of the benefits of system design, honestly, is it can kind of outweigh, potentially a bad coding interview if you just have, an interviewer that's particularly hard, or you just get kind of stuck or something like that.
All right. Thank you, Arjun. So you mentioned in the start that, the system design rounds haven't really changed that much. It's just gotten a little difficult, maybe the questions. But, building up on that, what are some of the new and interesting case studies that have been recently added to this set of system design, to the question bank?
Yeah, I think this kind of touches a little bit on like the new questions that you're calling out, like batch processing, offline processing. I think for a while we were in a state where all the system design questions were very standard, CRUD services, or even like variations of that. So Facebook, YouTube, those types of things. I think now we're kind of getting to a point where the questions that are being asked are things like, offline processing, SQS processing, metrics aggregation, those types of things. So I think I would definitely pay attention to the domain of the team that you're interviewing for. That'll be a clue in terms of what you should maybe spend a little bit of extra time looking up before the interview to kind of see, okay, what do I need to consider? What do I need to look for? From a system design perspective, are there specific services or systems that this team uses or this domain uses that may come up in a system design interview? So it can be somewhat domain. Sorry, I just cut. I think my laptop just went to sleep, but it can be somewhat domain specific.
All right. Thank you, Arjun. Now let's shift gears and talk about you. What is your favorite system design question to ask a candidate? Do you have a favorite? Do you have like a go-to question that you love asking a candidate?
Yeah, so I'll give two. I think the main one I use, and for those of for the people that have kind of experienced this on IK interviews, they might be familiar with it. But I like asking a very simple question, which is design a paste bin, which is a very standard question. It's probably on all the the coursework, and there's probably a bunch of YouTube videos and stuff on it. But it's basically design a very simple service that you go to a website, you click paste, and you get back a unique link to the paste. But the reason I like it so much is because it touches on a lot of different aspects of designing systems. So it touches on hashing, it touches on data structures, it touches on caching and like load balancers and things like that. So while it's not a particularly deep question in terms of functional requirements, it does touch on a lot of different aspects that will come up during systems and interviews. So you can really kind of get to see someone's deliberate thoughts, like whether they have a really good process. And even though it's like deceptively simple, I feel like it gives me a really good sense of what someone would be like to work with if they were given that type of a question. Or if they were given a very ambiguous question, like are they very deliberate, even though the question itself is maybe somewhat simple. The other question I like to use, and sometimes I'll use this if I've already asked this one before, or if people want something that's a little bit harder, is to design a rate limiter for a service. Because this is, a lot of the questions that get asked are pretty standard, design Facebook, design YouTube. This is a little bit different. Because it touches on different rate limiter algorithms. It's not just, have a database and be inserting stuff into it. It's a little bit more varied than that. And it can be a little bit challenging if people don't understand, what the different rate limiter algorithms and things like that. But it's a good challenge question. And I think it kind of touches on like subject matter expertise. So sometimes when people want like a more difficult question, that's the one I'll use.
All right. So Arjun, again, still talking about your what you look for interviews. One thing we did not touch upon is resumes. When a candidate is looking to get shortlisted in the resume round, what are the few things that you look for in a resume before you invite them for an interview?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the number one thing is whether they've had good software development experience as a lead. And I don't mean a lead in the sense of they have direct reports or things like that. I mean, as a lead is, have they kind of led projects? Like, have they been like the main kind of technical IC that maybe, even if they don't necessarily have people reporting to them, they have people that kind of work with them, and maybe they're directing a little bit or like breaking down tasks and things like that. Because you really want to see someone who can kind of operate independently, deliver on projects that are like kind of somewhat ambiguous, that doesn't kind of need a lot of hand holding, those sorts of things. So I try to look for kind of clues in the resume that kind of tell me, like, is this person just and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is this person just kind of executing on requirements that are given to others, or do they have more kind of technical ownership? And I try to look for candidates that have maybe a little bit more technical ownership from that standpoint.
All right, great. So Arjun, my last question for you, and then I'm going to let you go. Since how long have you been teaching at IK, and what got you to teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've been at IK about a year, I think, at this point. I started because I kind of wanted to see how it. I wanted to kind of improve my own interviewing skills, and I also
Mhm.
wanted to be a better interviewer for Amazon or for whichever company I work at. And I was a little bit unsure of whether that would work when I first started out here, but then after I did a couple, I really started to like it. I really started to like talking to people. I really started to like helping them. So I kind of stuck with it ever since then. I feel like I've gotten a lot better of an interviewer since I've started. I feel like I understand technical concepts a little bit more because I'm explaining it to different people. So I've been very kind of happy with that experience, and I intend to kind of keep doing it as long as I can.
What do you do? Do you take mock interviews? Do you also take live
Mock interviews,
classes? Mock
mostly
interviews.
mock interviews. Yeah.
All right, all right. Great. That's a wrap from me, Arjun. Thank you so much for taking out the time to do this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And
But
if
before that,
sorry.
do you have any closing words, any golden advice to students aspiring for companies like Amazon?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to kind of keep at it.
Mhm.
It can take multiple tries, but I would just like keep at it on, preparing, whether it's, coding or whether it's system design or behavioral or anything like that. Just keep doing it. I don't think there's any kind of like, I don't think that this is like whether it's Amazon or whether it's a different company like Google or Facebook or whatever. I don't think there's anything secret to kind of working at one of these
Yeah.
places or working at a different company or anything like that. I would just like kind of keep preparing until you kind of get a job that you really like, whether it's at a Faang or whether it's at a different company that's non-Faang. Because I think fundamentally things like system design, things like lead code are really just a question of kind of effort and not of
Mhm.
ability. So if you put in the time, if you put in the prep, you should be able to do really well. There is a little bit of randomness, which can be definitely discouraging. I know I've been discouraged as well. But as long as you kind of keep putting in the time to prep, you should be fine. Eventually, like you'll kind of be able to break one of them, and you'll be able to get a job that you really like.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Arjun. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, and best of luck to all the IK students that are watching this.
Thank you. Bye bye.